Hello, our story today is found in Luke chapter 5, verses 12 to 15, and it's entitled Unclean. Some mornings, when I first awaken, I would think it had all been just a terrible dream, and then I would roll over and see not my wife and children on their mats beside me in the pale early light, but rows of other men. And then I would remember that the nightmare and reality were one. My roommates were a Maccabee sort. Their limbs were swollen and their bodies were covered with cater-like sores, deep red pits rimmed with scaly white flesh. The nodules that covered their foreheads, lips, and chins were like countless pebbles strewn across the sand. Every man was missing at least a couple of fingers and toes. A few wretched souls had almost none. Their skins, which sagged and draped limply along their gaunt faces, looked like leather. Eyes were sunken and weak, noses had collapsed. The men trembled in their sleep as dry coughs shook their skeletal frames. These were the outcasts of society, the living dead, just like me. This reality was a horror from which I would never awaken. I was a leper. The day that changed everything started out like any other. I rolled my mat and placed it in the corner, a task much more difficult after I lost a thumb and 2 fingers to injuries. I was also missing a small toe on my right foot. It was very difficult to protect fingers and toes once all sensation in them was lost. My missing nose was another story entirely. It seemed to simply collapse in on itself bit by bit. All my eyelashes had fallen out and my eyes had become so sensitive to the sunlight that I was limited to scavenging at certain hours of the day. That morning I slowly made my way out of the house into the early morning light. My legs were heavy, but I pushed them as fast as I could go. The incessant gnawing in my empty stomach was driving my feeble body to the city gate in hopes that someone passing by would pity me and toss me a piece of bread. I glanced down at my feet to see blood seeping into my sandal from a sore I could not feel on the bottom of my foot. And then I heard footsteps ahead. I drew to the far edge of the road and pulled the edge of my head covering across the lower half of my face to cover my nose and shouted the designated warning just as the travelers came into sight. "Unclean! Unclean!" The revulsion was immediate and obvious. Some were horrified by my wounds. Others were terrified such fate could befall on them. But the worst of all were those who snarled in contempt, confident that my affliction was an outward expression of God's judgment, that of some secret sin. After all, wasn't leprosy called the finger of God? "Bread! Bread!" I begged as the travelers hurried past. One young man paused and reached into his pocket, tore off a chunk of bread and tossed it to me before hurrying away. The bread rolled through the dust to my feet. I picked it up, quickly brushed it off, and devoured it as I continued on my way. After a while I grew weary of dragging my heavy legs along the road, and even wearier from the horror openly expressed by travelers I passed. So I stopped for shelter in the shade of a rock outcropping far enough away to no longer offend, but still close enough to get bits of the conversation that drifted to me from the road. Over and over the travelers were excited, discussing the same topic. The great healer and miracle worker, Jesus of Nazareth, was nearby. His fame was spreading throughout all Judea. They said he healed the lame, the blind, the deaf and mute. Oh, I couldn't help but think, what if he could heal me too? I knew, of course, that leprosy was no common illness. No one had heard of anyone being cured of leprosy in hundreds of years. As a matter of fact, it was commonly believed that healing leprosy was one of the 4 miracles only Messiah himself could do. And that's one reason why there was specific temple protocol for any leper claiming to have been healed. He was required to present himself to the priests, who would inspect the man's body and then investigate his claim. If the healing was found to be valid, the priest would then begin the process of confirming whether or not Messiah had indeed come at last. As I sat in the dust, I looked down at my disfigured body and my filthy rags. I thought of my wife and children. I wondered if my mother was still living, if there were any chance I could be reunited with my family. I had to seize it. I struggled to my feet and trudged on. Unclean! Unclean! And when at last I came to Jesus, a large crowd surrounded him. I stood at a distance for a moment, my heart pounding in terror at the thought of crossing the road, breaking the law, and casting my vile decaying flesh into the midst of all that was whole and good. I took one shuddering breath and limped my way toward him. Someone spotted me, and the cry was raised, and the crowd scattered. But Jesus stood firm. I threw myself face down into the dust at his feet, weeping, begging for mercy, believing the unbelievable, that he was Messiah and was therefore able to make even me whole. Lord, if you are willing, can you make me clean? Jesus did the most astonishing thing. He reached out his hand to me and touched me. He wasn't repulsed by my filth. He wasn't afraid of my decay. I am willing, he said. Be clean. Oh, I wish I could describe what happened next, but words fail me. There was power, great power, and life-transforming love flowing through me. Strength returned to my muscles, feelings surged into my limbs, fingers and toes were simply restored. I pulled back the sleeves of my robe to see perfect, smooth skin. I gingerly lifted my fingers to my face to find the nodules gone and my nose just as it should be. I was speechless, overcome with awe and gratitude. Oh, I looked up into his kind face as tears of thankfulness streamed down my cheeks. Then he said to me, "Don't tell anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest, and offer the sacrifices that Moses commanded for your cleansing as a testimony to them." And I rose to make my way to the temple in Jerusalem. I was unclean no more. My God, the world is fraught with suffering. Be near today to those who are outcast and in desperate poverty, and give me ears to hear their cries and an open hand to help meet their needs. Break my heart, Jesus, for those for whom your heart breaks, that I may extend mercy to the untouchables and receive the forgotten as your dear children. Thank you for listening, and have a wonderful day.